In the spring of 1989, thousands of student demonstrators and their supporters amassed in the heart of Beijing, protesting for democracy for the Chinese people. On the night of June 3rd, the Chinese Communist Party ordered tanks into Tiananmen Square, and the flower of Beijing's educated youth were crushed under the treads of T-54s. 1 year later, another protest occurred, this time in Taipei's Chiang Kai-Shek Memorial Hall. The torch had been passed, and now it was the turn of Taiwan's young and promising future to protest against their authoritarian regime. Instead of sending in tanks to grind his own people into the road, Taiwanese President Lee Teng-Hui invited the leaders of the student movement into the presidential building, heard their concerns, and promised to implement their demands. 6 years later, Lee Teng-Hui was re-elected, not by members of his own party, but by the general Taiwanese public, becoming the first democratically elected president in Taiwanese history. Today, the island nation of Taiwan boasts one of the most progressive societies on the Pacific Rim, but it was not always this way. The road to Taiwanese self-representation was a long and tumultuous one which winds through centuries of colonialism and decades of modern dictatorship. Welcome to our video on the modern history of Taiwan, in which we will explore how a country once under martial law blossomed into one of the healthiest democracies in all of Asia. The island of Taiwan, also known as Isla Formosa, has been home to human civilization for at least 6,000 years. Its original inhabitants were Austronesian tribes, ancestrally related to many modern ethnic groups in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia and the Philippines, who lived a village lifestyle which centered around a form of ordered warfare based on ritual headhunting. Despite being only 100 miles off what is now the southern Chinese coastline, Taiwan existed outside of Chinese civilization's sphere of influence for much of the latter's dynastic history. From the 17th century onwards, the island was colonized by a carousel of foreign powers, beginning with the Dutch, then a rogue Chinese pirate Qing, then the Great Qing, an imperial Chinese dynasty founded by the northern Manchu people. It was only during Qing rule, as recently as around 200 years ago, that the island of Taiwan became predominantly Chinese in character, with vagabonds, adventurers and fortune seekers from Fujian province migrating by the thousands each year and assimilating the indigenous tribes of the Western Plains. The version of Chinese society that came to dominate Taiwan during this time was heavily influenced by the regional culture of Fujian, the southern Chinese province from which the overwhelming majority of cross-strait migrants came. These migrants spoke the so-called dialects of Hokkien and Hakka, two Chinese languages which were mutually unintelligible with Mandarin, the language of the imperial court. Moreover, the high mountain indigenous tribes of the inaccessible eastern mountain ranges continued to resist assimilation, defending their ancestral lands and headhunting traditions. Overall, Taiwan during Qing rule was home to many different peoples with different cultures and languages, united only in the fact that they were all notoriously disloyal to the imperial government in Beijing. By the 19th century, Taiwan had become synonymous with anarchy, with both indigenous tribes and Fujianese settlers launching frequent insurrections against their Manchu overlords. Soon, the long-gowned ministers in the imperial court cynically began referring to the island by a popular idiom: every 3 years an uprising, every 5 years a rebellion. In 1895, the newly industrialized Empire of Japan thrashed the antiquated Manchurian dynasty in the First Sino-Japanese War. In the subsequent Treaty of Shimonoseki, China ceded a gift bag of goodies to Japan, including the island of Taiwan. Thus, from 1895 onwards, Taiwan entered a 50-year period as a Japanese colony. As a nation that had industrialized at a breakneck speed in order to catch up with the European powers of the age, Japan's goal was to turn Taiwan into a so-called model colony in order to demonstrate their advanced technology to the West. To that end, the Japanese colonial government initiated a litany of reforms, which dramatically altered Taiwanese society in largely positive ways. The establishment of modern hospitals eliminated many tropical diseases like malaria and improved public health, while the introduction of railroads, running water, electricity, telephone lines and modern schools brought Taiwan out of the Middle Ages and into the 20th century. By the 1930s, Taiwan enjoyed a much higher standard of living than mainland China, much of which was still stuck in a pre-industrial state. With that said, the Taiwanese were still second-class citizens living under foreign occupation, All the highest levels in government were reserved for ethnic Japanese, and the Japanese military and police were swift in eradicating any dissent against their rule, killing tens of thousands of Taiwanese over the years. Throughout the early 20th century, Japanese troops marched into the eastern mountains and brought the last free indigenous villages to heel, putting a final end to their ancient headhunting rituals. Throughout the Second World War, an upsurge in state propaganda compelled thousands of young Taiwanese men to volunteer in the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces and fight in the Pacific Theater, where they saw battle against American and Australian troops. After the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the era of Japan's colonial empire ended, and it renounced all rights to Taiwan by signing the San Francisco Treaty of 1951. Thereafter, Taiwan was reunited with China. However, the Chinese mainland that Taiwan was now ostensibly reuniting with was vastly different from the one from which it had been parted 50 years ago. Back in 1911, the infant emperor on the throne of the senile Qing dynasty was overthrown, resulting in the end of over 2,000 years of ancient dynastic tradition. In its place was established the brainchild of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the Republic of China, governed by the Nationalist Party of China, or Kuomintang. By 1927, the Kuomintang had come under the control of one Generalissimo Chiang Kai-Shek, the strongman who would later play a central role in the shaping of modern Taiwan. A far cry from the democratic ideals envisioned by his party's founders, Chiang Kai-Shek led a right-wing authoritarian regime plagued by corruption, cronyism, and political violence. Labeling leftists, communists, and labor unionists as dangerous to the state, Chiang had them ruthlessly purged. The backlash from this directly contributed to the meteoric rise of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, which triggered the beginning of the Chinese Civil War. The conflict between the nationalists and communists was put on pause during World War II, throughout which the Kuomintang was forced to withstand the tides of the brutal Imperial Japanese war machine. By the war's end, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime was absolutely battered, but no sooner had their war with the Japanese ended did their war with the communists resume. By 1945, the future of the Kuomintang looked bleak, but at least they had now gained the former Japanese colony of Taiwan, an island which the Republic of China had never actually controlled up until this point. Initially, many Taiwanese welcomed the arrival of their new Kuomintang rulers, hopeful that their reunion with the Chinese motherland would finally make them first-class citizens in their own land. Unfortunately, their hopes were misfounded. A cultural divide quickly emerged between the native Taiwanese and the Republicans who came over from the mainland. While the mainlanders and Taiwanese both considered themselves ethnic Han Chinese, the differences between them were stark. The majority of mainlanders did not speak the local Hoklo and Hakka languages, while the Taiwanese did not speak Mandarin or other mainland dialects. Moreover, to many Taiwanese, the mainlanders looked as if they had come from 50 years in the past, with the Taiwanese looking down on the new arrivals as uncouth peasants in straw shoes, laughing at their inability to grasp the function behind basic modern amenities, such as electricity or running water. The mainlanders, on the other hand, looked upon the Taiwanese with suspicion, denigrating them as former Japanese lackeys. Within a year of the new management, many Taiwanese had grown resentful of their new overlords. The Kuomintang appointed governor of Taiwan, a man named Chen Yi, was deeply unpopular among the native islanders. The government monopolies he imposed on products like tobacco and salt were widely reviled, and due to a lack of health knowledge, diseases like cholera, which had been wiped out during the Japanese period, made their ignominious return to Taiwan during his rule. Soon, many Taiwanese came to see the mainlanders not as liberators, but just another brand of oppressor, perhaps even worse than the Japanese had been. These tensions would soon boil over into the single most consequential event in modern Taiwanese history, the February 28th uprising. On the morning of February 27, 1947, a young Taipei widow was selling cigarettes on the street when she was apprehended by agents of the Kuomintang Monopoly Bureau, who came to seize her product. When the woman protested this, an agent pulled out his sidearm and pistol-whipped her. This action incited outrage from bystanders, and soon an angry mob formed, which quickly ballooned in size and began fanning out across the country. By March 5th, protesters were in control of practically all of Taiwan. Governor Chen Yi was left powerless, lacking the manpower to quell what was now an island-wide uprising. Yet word of the emergency in Taiwan quickly reached ROC headquarters in Chongqing, and an army was deployed to Taiwan to restore order. The result was a massacre. Kuomintang forces crushed the uprising with brutal efficiency, massacring thousands of Taiwanese. After the dust settled, a large portion of the native Taiwanese leadership, including the flower of its educated youth, lay dead in the streets. The consequences of the February 28th uprising were traumatic on a generational level, permanently scarring the psyche of Taiwanese people. Although the Kuomintang regime heavily censored its butchery in a manner similar to how the CCP censors the Tiananmen Square massacre, the February 28th uprising lived on in the social memory of many Taiwanese, and served as a rallying cry for future generations of Taiwanese demonstrators fighting for democracy and an end to authoritarian one-party rule. In May of 1949, President Chiang Kai-Shek declared martial law in Taiwan, giving his police and military sweeping powers to crack down on dissidents and solidifying the Nationalist Party's authoritarian hold over Formosa. Yet as the Kuomintang strengthened their grip on Taiwan, their homeland of mainland China was slipping from their grasp. By the end of 1949, the Chinese Civil War had all been lost. Thus, in December of that year, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the nationalist government to move to Taipei. In an exodus of biblical proportions, over 1 million Chinese mainlanders, consisting of soldiers, government personnel and families, crossed the strait and entered into their new home in exile. Shortly after, the Communist Party of China assumed complete control of the Chinese mainland. For Chiang Kai-shek, Taiwan was never meant to be a permanent home, but a base from where he would lick his wounds and eventually strike back to retake the mainland. However, events did not unfold as he had planned, as he and his army were ultimately confined to Taiwan for the rest of his life. After settling into their new home, the Kuomintang initiated a period of political persecutions, known as the White Terror. Paranoid of communist spies among the general Taiwanese population, anyone suspected of having any ties to communism were rounded up by the secret police. The White Terror continued well into the 1980s, throughout which the nationalist government jailed over 29,000 of its own citizens, among whom many were tortured and around 5,000 executed. White Terror was an apt name indeed, for the Taiwanese people lived terrified that any day they might disappear off the streets and vanish from society, their friends and neighbours pretending as if they'd never known them, out of fear they may be next. Much as it had been under the Japanese, the Taiwanese were second-class citizens under Kuomintang rule, restricted from holding office in the highest levels of government, military, the police force and the education system. The government did not represent its constituents, as the National Assembly was composed of delegates representing provinces in mainland China no longer under their control. Upon their exile to Taiwan, these delegates chose to indefinitely extend their terms until re-elections on the mainland were possible again, which in retrospect we know was never. This would be the equivalent of if the United States government was expelled to Hawaii, but every US senator was given power for life and invested with legislative powers over Hawaii while still representing the states they no longer lived in. Throughout their rule over Taiwan, the Kuomintang implemented a policy of forced national homogenization, aimed to assimilate the Taiwanese people into what they saw as mainstream Chinese culture. The local languages of Hokkien and Hakka were suppressed, with the state education system imposing the colonial language of Mandarin Chinese on its students. Students who spoke Hokkien or Hakka at school were often subject to fines and humiliation. Moreover, school curriculums were heavily sinicized. Local Taiwanese histories were erased completely, and an emphasis was placed on fostering an affinity with the Chinese mainland, a place the majority of Taiwanese had never been to. National homogenization policies also impacted the indigenous Austronesian communities in the Eastern Highlands, with the Kuomintang deliberately undermining indigenous cultures and identities and implementing policies designed to make the mountain tribes become Han Chinese, with the tagline of "making the mountains like the plains." In all parts of Taiwan, the media was tightly controlled and censored by the government. Freedom of the press was non-existent, and a ban was placed on the founding of non-state sanctioned newspapers. Despite all these oppressions, it was during this era of authoritarianism that the seeds of Taiwan's eventual democratic blooming were planted. Perhaps the most important of these seeds was the overall high levels of education among the Taiwanese people. during a time when the vast majority of people in mainland China were illiterate and had no access to formal education. Taiwan enjoyed a healthy school system, attended by the majority of the island's youth. Although the nationalist regime tightly controlled the Taiwanese education system and placed policemen in schools and universities to monitor the spread of subversive ideas, its investment in widespread education created a literate society, thereby giving its citizens a crucial tool in disseminating democratic ideas. Another factor that facilitated Taiwan's eventual transition to democracy was the ability of Taiwanese people to participate in limited local elections. Although the highest levels of government were reserved for a cadre of mainlander oligarchs in the ruling party, native Taiwanese were permitted to run for seats at the village and township level, something they would leverage for greater representation down the line. By the 1970s, the now elderly Chiang Kai-Shek had begun stepping away from politics and handing the reins to his son, Chiang Ching-kuo. In 1972, Chiang Ching-kuo became the party premier and de facto ruler of Taiwan. 3 years later, Chiang Kai-shek passed away at the age of 87, going down in history as either Taiwan's founding father or seminal oppressor, depending on who you ask. In 1978, his son was officially elected president by the aging members of the National Assembly. Chiang Ching-kuo was a man with a complicated legacy, remembered by some as a reformer and by some as an oppressor. Under his presidency, business in Taiwan boomed. Moreover, Chiang Ching-kuo initiated a partial Taiwanization of the Kuomintang, allowing some liberal, Western-educated Taiwanese intellectuals into the higher echelons of his party. However, these new additions remained a minority, with old fossils from the mainland still continuing to dominate the government. The new president's initiation of an era of quasi-liberalization gave many Taiwanese hope that the era of white terror and violent suppression was behind them, emboldening them to push for greater native Taiwanese representation within the government. By the late 1970s, this had resulted in the formation of the Tangwai movement. The Tangwai, meaning outside the party, was a loosely knit coalition of various low-level politicians who, titularly, were not members of the Kuomintang. As the Tangwai movement grew in popularity, Chiang Ching-kuo's regime decided to remind the Taiwanese people that, liberalization or no, the country they lived in was no true democracy. In 1977, Tangwai candidates won 34% of the vote in elections for the Taiwan Provincial Assembly. This was an impressive turnout, given that the system was weighted heavily in favor of Kuomintang candidates. However, when Tangwai ballots were destroyed and tampered with by government agents, a riot broke out in the town of Zhongli. The protesters were eventually scattered by tear gas and lethal force, resulting in 2 deaths. The Zhongli incident marked the first mass protest against the government since the February 28th uprising 30 years earlier. Despite the government crackdown, the Tangwai movement was energized by this event and resolved to continue the fight for true democracy. An already strengthening opposition against the government was further emboldened in 1979 with a seismic shift in international politics. That year, the United States broke off official diplomatic relations with the Nationalist Republic of China rump state in Taiwan and decided to recognize the People's Republic of China's effective control over mainland China. This came after the Republic of China had renounced its seat in the United Nations, and its seat in the UN Security Council had been taken up by its communist rival in 1971. Although the United States continued to be a key ally to the Nationalist Party after this, it was still a massive blow to the Kuomintang's prestige and undermined the core propaganda it fed to the Taiwanese people. The Kuomintang had always promoted the idea that the Taiwanese people were mainstream Chinese. However, as the Republic of China lost political ground to the CCP internationally, and their claim to being the legitimate government of China waned, this rhetoric began to ring more and more hollow. Consequently, despite government crackdowns on their leaders like the Kaohsiung incident of 1979, Tangwai activists printed independent newspapers in defiance of the state-controlled media monopoly and promoted a unique island identity among the Formosan population, which was not nationalist Chinese or communist Chinese, but Taiwanese. The 1980s marked the twilight years for autocratic rule in Taiwan. On top of growing pro-democratic sentiment at home, the ruling regime also faced increased scrutiny from by far its most important geopolitical ally, the United States, over its pushback against democratic movements. It was an undeniable fact that the times were changing. In 1986, the hitherto loosely associated members of the Tangwai movement took advantage of this to form a united political party, the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP. At this point in time, opposition political parties were still banned in Taiwan, but given the current political climate, Chiang Ching-kuo ordered his government and secret police to not interfere with the DPP in any way. In 1987, Chiang Ching-kuo even put a final end to the martial law implemented by his father 38 years earlier. On July 13, 1988, President Chiang Ching-kuo passed away at the age of 77. Ultimately, the son of Taiwan's seminal authoritarian had been more progressive than his father, but not progressive enough to bring full liberal democracy to Taiwan. That accomplishment was instead claimed by the successor Chiang Ching-kuo had groomed to take his place, Lee Teng-Hui. Elected to the presidency by the Geriatric National Assembly after Chiang Ching-kuo's passing, Lee Teng-Hui was different from his predecessor in one key way. Unlike the majority of the Kuomintang, Lee was not a transplanted exile from the mainland, but a native-born Taiwanese. Lee Teng-Hui was born in the Japanese colony of Taiwan in 1923. During World War II, Lee Teng-Hui volunteered in the Imperial Japanese Army, serving as an anti-aircraft artillery officer for the duration of the war. After the war's end, he pursued an education in America, receiving a master's in agricultural science at Iowa State University in 1953 and a PhD in the field at Cornell University in 1968. In 1972, then Premier Chiang Ching-kuo took note of Lee Teng-Hui's impressive education and appointed him to his cabinet as a minister in charge of agriculture. During this period, Lee contributed much to Taiwan's agricultural mechanization. Lee quickly became one of Chiang Ching-kuo's favorites, and thus began rocketing upwards through the party's ranks. Many hardliners within the party protested Lee's ascension, but Chiang Ching-kuo shielded his protege from the mainlander elites attempting to have him purged. By the end of Chiang Ching-kuo's life, Lee Teng-Hui had become the obvious heir apparent to the presidency. His ascension in 1988 marked the beginning of a new era in Formosa. Lee Teng-Hui was the first Taiwanese head of state to be born in Taiwan and speak the local Taiwanese Hokkien language as his mother tongue, not just since the beginning of Kuomintang rule in 1945, but arguably since the beginning of recorded Taiwanese history. Unlike his predecessors, who'd always kept one eye on the Chinese mainland they dreamed of reclaiming, Lee Teng-Hui was invested only in his native Formosa and its future. Lee Teng-Hui's ascension to the presidency was not without its perils. Immediately upon beginning his tenure, he was faced with potentially lethal opposition from the mainlander elites in his party, including Chiang Ching-kuo's widow. A shrewd politician, President Lee played a dangerous game of balance between appeasement and internal reform. By February of 1990, he had managed to neutralize hardliner opposition against him, and in so doing, ended over 40 years of the Chiang family's domination over Taiwan. The next month, students in the National Taiwan University seized upon the momentum of the change in regime, taking to the streets of Taipei. This protest became known as the Wild Lily Student Movement, named after the indigenous Formosan lilies worn by the demonstrators. The Wild Lily demonstrators demanded the full democratization of Taiwan, calling for direct elections in which the president and vice president would be chosen by the general Taiwanese public rather than by a small group of electors within the Kuomintang. The students also called for the re-election of all seats in the National Assembly, many of which were still held by old men, representing Chinese provinces they had not been to in over 40 years. The Wild Lily protests were occurring during a tenuous time in the Chinese-speaking world. Just 1 year earlier, a very similar protest had taken place in mainland China, consisting of students demanding full democratization from an ostensibly liberalizing authoritarian regime. The result of that had been the infamous 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. Thus, the world's eyes were now on Taiwan, waiting with bated breath to see if the Wild Lily demonstrators would share the same fate as their counterparts across the strait. Fortunately, this would not be the case. China and Taiwan were two different societies that had gone down two different paths. Instead of cracking down on the protesters, Lee Teng-Hui invited their student leaders into the presidential building, conversed with them directly, agreeing to their demands, and promising to initiate the full democratization of Taiwan. 6 years later, in 1996, Lee Teng-Hui was once more elected president of Taiwan. This time, however, his election did not come from members of his own party, but from nearly 6 million members of the Taiwanese public. With a 54% share of the vote, Lee Teng-Hui became the first democratically elected president in Taiwanese history. 4 years later, another general election was held, which resulted in the election of one Chen Shui-bian, a former Tangwai activist and leader of the Democratic Progressive Party, ending 55 years of Kuomintang control over the island of Taiwan. In 2008 and 2016, Taiwan experienced its second and third peaceful transfers of political power through direct presidential elections, further solidifying Taiwan's democracy. The 2016 election saw the election of the Democratic Progressive Party's Tsai Ing-wen, the first female president of Taiwan. Tsai Ing-wen's presidency strengthened the pillars of Taiwan's democratic future by seeking to mend the scars of its authoritarian past. During her two-term 8-year tenure, the government created agencies such as the Transitional Justice Commission and the Ill-Gotten Party Assets Settlement Committee. These agencies were tasked with uncovering historical truths about the era of political suppression, exonerating those convicted of political crimes during the White Terror, and financially compensating Taiwanese citizens whose property was seized by the state during the period of martial law. On February 28, 2024, the 77th anniversary of the 228 massacre and the final months of Tsai Ing-wen's presidency, the president emphasized the importance of transitional justice. She further impressed that these restorative measures were not targeted at any one political party. Instead, it was the non-partisan duty of any democratic government to take responsibility for its nation's past and make amends for past harms. Honestly facing up to our history, President Tsai declared, is the only way Taiwan's democratic institutions can become more deeply rooted and continue to evolve. Members of the current opposition party supported these sentiments. Indeed, the Kuomintang remains prominent in Taiwan to this day. No longer the authoritarian rulers of Taiwan, it is now an active participant in the democratic system that members of its own party, such as Lee Teng-Hui, helped bring about. With each passing generation, the once hostile lines between mainlander and native Taiwanese becomes more and more blurred as the Taiwanese people reject the social stratifications of the past, embracing both its status as the inheritor of Dr. Sun Sat-yen's dream of a democratic Chinese republic and its own unique island identity. In January 2024, Taiwan held its 8th direct presidential election, electing Lai Ching-te as its 5th democratically elected president. As of the making of this video, Taiwan has been a liberal democracy for nearly 30 years, with each election further demonstrating that the island's commitment to the peaceful transfer of power is one embraced both by the older generations of Taiwanese who brought democracy to the island and the newer generations of Taiwanese who have inherited it. Today, the nation of Taiwan is a full democracy with a multi-party political system. The Democratic Progressive Party held the presidency and the majority in the legislature from 2016 to 2024, while the Kuomintang, Taiwan's primary opposition party, regained its position as the majority party in the legislature starting in January this year. Taiwan is not a perfect society, no country can boast that. Yet it is a country where the people can choose their leaders, where they can speak their Hokkien, Hakka, and indigenous Austronesian languages openly, and express themselves freely in art and media. In many ways, the future of Taiwan remains uncertain, especially with the sword of Damocles dangling over them, in the form of their giant hostile neighbour across the strait. However, the Taiwanese youths of today enjoy a society which is far freer than the ones their parents and grandparents lived in. A society which embraces freedom and multiculturality rather than suppresses it. That, at least, is something to celebrate, as are the generations of brave Taiwanese who helped bring this society about. This video is sponsored by the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Canada. More videos on modern history are on the way. To make sure that you don't miss them, please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.